but participate, make suggestions, things like that. And even as a 6-year-old, I mean, my dad was having to read the lines at the read-through, and I would just kind of sit there at first. My father rants.
There's something about a child who grows up right in front of you, week after week, season after season, that makes you feel like you know him. And for millions of Americans in the 1960s, that child was a little red-headed boy named Opie Taylor. But the boy behind Opie, his real story has always been a little more complicated, a little more surprising, and a whole lot more interesting than what you ever saw on screen. This is the hidden life of Ron Howard from The Andy Griffith Show. The boy from Oklahoma. Ron Howard wasn't born into Hollywood glamour. He came into the world on March 1st, 1954, in Duncan, Oklahoma, a small town far removed from any studio lot. His father, Rance Howard, was born with the last name Beckenholt and had taken the stage name Howard back in 1948 when he began pursuing an acting career. His mother, Jean Spiegel Howard, was also an actress. When Ron was born, Rance was actually still serving 3 years in the United States Air Force, so the family's Hollywood chapter hadn't truly begun yet. It was in 1958, 4 years after Ron's birth, that the Howards packed up and moved west to California. They rented a house just 1 block south of DeSilu Studios in Hollywood, the very lot where The Andy Griffith Show would later be filmed. It's one of those details that, in hindsight, feels almost like the universe arranging things on purpose. Ron's younger brother, Clint Howard, arrived not long after the family settled in California, and from early on, the Howard household was a place where the performing arts were simply part of the air they breathed. Rance never pushed his sons in a manufactured stage parent sort of way. Instead, he taught them as a craftsman teaches an apprentice, with patience, with purpose, and with deep respect for the work itself. He believed in emotional honesty over tricks and mechanics, in understanding a scene rather than performing a scene. Ron's screen debut happened when he was just 18 months old, in a 1956 film called Frontier Woman. He was barely more than a baby, and yet the camera had already found him. By the time he was 5 years old, he was working in front of it with a kind of ease that experienced adult actors envied. He appeared in an episode of The Twilight Zone, picked up a role in Dennis the Menace, and showed up in Lassie. The work kept coming because the talent was genuine, but also because Rance understood how to position his son without exploiting him. In 1959, Ron had his first credited film role in The Journey, a Hungarian Revolution drama directed by Anatol Litvak. He was 5 years old. A year later, the phone rang with news that would define his childhood, and in many ways, the rest of his life. The audition that changed everything. The Andy Griffith Show didn't quite begin as its own series. It grew out of an episode of The Danny Thomas Show, then called Make Room for Daddy, in which Andy Griffith guest starred as a small-town Southern sheriff. The chemistry was palpable, and it wasn't long before producers were developing a full show around him. The question of who would play his son became crucial. Ron Howard, at 6 years old, auditioned and was cast. When the show premiered on October 3rd, 1960, he was in it, and he would remain in it for all 8 seasons, right through 1968. He was credited as Ronnie Howard throughout the run, a name that would stick affectionately in the memories of viewers long after he'd grown well beyond it. But here's something most people don't know about how the character of Opie came to be the Opie they remember. Originally, the character had been written as a wisecracking, precocious kid, the kind of sassy child that populated nearly every family sitcom of the era. Think of Rusty Hamer's character on The Danny Thomas Show, or any number of similar child roles from the period. Quick with a comeback, endearing through attitude. Rance Howard watched the pilot and quietly approached Andy Griffith on the side. He wasn't a famous actor, wasn't someone whose opinion would be taken for granted, but he offered it anyway. He pointed out that Opie was being written in the same mold as all those other TV kids, and then he asked a simple question: what if Opie actually respected his father? Andy Griffith, by his own account years later, took that idea back to the writers. The character was reworked, the wisecracking was toned down, and replaced with something more genuine. A boy who genuinely loved and admired his father. It was Ron's own real-life dynamic with Rance that had quietly shaped Opie Taylor into the character the whole country came to love. Ron didn't even know about this for years. He learned it much later, during the production of the 1986 TV film Return to Mayberry, when Andy finally told him the story directly. The origin of one of television's most beloved child characters had been quietly engineered by the boy's own father, on a backlot conversation that no cameras captured. Life on the DeSilu lot. The Andy Griffith Show was filmed at Desilu Studios, and for Ron, it was essentially a second home throughout the 1960s. He spent his formative years, from 6 to 14, in that environment, alongside adults who were professional, seasoned, and not always especially child-friendly in their habits. Ron has spoken openly about the crew on set, describing them as salty old characters who swore like sailors and drank like fish. Cigarettes were a constant presence. His eyes, he recalled, were always burning from the smoke. It was, in many ways, a very adult world, but his parents made sure he was never entirely swallowed by it. His father's job, unofficially, was to stand as a quiet line of dignity when the adult world crowded too close. Ron recalled one specific moment when he was around 10 years old, and the crew's joking had gotten a little blue, pulling him into the conversation as though he were one of the guys. Rance stepped in without making a scene. He simply told them, calmly, that Ron was 10 years old and this wasn't a locker room. People listened because Rance carried that kind of quiet authority. For the bulk of the school year, Ron wasn't at a private studio school. His parents kept him enrolled in public schools, Robert Louis Stevenson Elementary, then David Starr Jordan Junior High, eventually John Burroughs High School in Burbank. They didn't want him sealed off from ordinary life. He attended classes with other kids, he played Little League baseball, he had homework to do alongside his script lines. The novelty of being an actor wore off among classmates fairly quickly, and he became just another kid, which was exactly what his parents intended. During production weeks, Ron was tutored at Desilu Studios as required by California child labor laws, but the parents made sure those studio days didn't become his entire world. They deliberately limited his off-season work too. Beyond the Griffith Show, they allowed perhaps one additional project during breaks, and that was it, regardless of what offers came in. Rance and Jean didn't chase bigger paychecks. They chose a more measured life. There was something remarkable happening on those Thursday script read-throughs. The cast would gather, and the creative conversations that followed were open, collaborative, and remarkably freewheeling for a television production in that era. Little Opie was invited to stay. Ron sat in a room with Andy Griffith, Don Knotts, Francis Bavier, and the show's writers, watching them solve creative problems in real time. He absorbed it all, how a joke was constructed, how an emotional beat was found, how a story turned. Andy Griffith was the gravitational center of it. He had a clear artistic vision, and he enforced it with conviction. He told everyone, repeatedly, that the Andy Griffith Show wasn't going to be the Beverly Hillbillies or Lil Abner. It wasn't going to ask audiences to laugh at the characters. He wanted people to laugh with them. That distinction drove every decision. Watching a man of Andy's stature hold that line every week in front of writers and directors and a network, that was an education no film school could replicate. The moment he first felt like a storyteller. It was during the second episode of season 2, which would have put Ron at around 7 years old, when something happened that he has described as a turning point. He was in rehearsal, and he had a line to deliver that required him to enter the sheriff's office with some kind of greeting for Andy. He paused. He told the director he didn't think a kid his age would actually say it that way. The director, Bob Sweeney, himself a former actor, didn't dismiss him. He asked the boy how a kid would say it. Ron offered a small rewrite. Sweeney looked at it, nodded, and told him to go ahead. They rehearsed it. When they finished, Ron was standing there beaming, and Andy Griffith looked at him squinting and asked what he was grinning at. Ron told him that was the first idea of his they'd ever used. Griffith waited a beat and told him it was the first one that was any damn good. Then they got back to work. It was the right answer, delivered with exactly the right amount of gruffness and warmth. But what that moment planted in Ron was something durable, a sense that he had a voice, and that the right people might listen to it. He described feeling a surge of being involved in something, not just performing in it, actually making it. By the time he was 10, a director on the show had taken him aside and told him something that must have settled somewhere important. He'd noticed the way Ron watched the camera during rehearsals, even in scenes he wasn't part of. He told the boy he had a feeling he was going to be a director someday. Around 12, the films of that era began pulling at him. The Graduate, Romeo and Juliet, Bonnie and Clyde, a new wave of American cinema with an anarchy and emotional rawness he hadn't encountered before. He started shooting his own short films on a Super 8 camera at home. The actor's life was still present, still rewarding, but a second life was quietly beginning to grow alongside it. Andy, Don, and the world of Mayberry. The relationship between Andy Griffith and Ron Howard was one of the most genuinely warm in the history of American television, and it continued long past the show's 8-year run. Andy, in interviews, always spoke of Ron's upbringing as the key to who he became. He credited Rance and Gene Howard repeatedly, describing them as wonderful parents who gave their son something solid to stand on. He said that Ron only ever saw him as a friend, not a father figure, not a boss, but a friend. And from Ron's side, the word that kept returning was uncle. Andy was like a wonderful uncle to him, he said. He created an atmosphere of hard work and fun on that set that Ron carried with him as a director for decades after. The connection between Andy and Don Knotts was equally formative for young Ron to witness. The two men had known each other before the show. They'd met on Broadway, performing together in No Time for Sergeants beginning in 1955, and their friendship shaped the creative culture of the production. Don played Deputy Barney Fife with 5 Emmy Awards worth of genius, and what Ron observed was a creative partnership between two people who pushed each other without diminishing each other. In 2025, Ron made a revelation that landed with a certain sweetness. He shared an old photograph on Instagram, taken sometime in 1996 or 97, when Andy and Don had surprised him with a visit on the set of the Mel Gibson thriller Ransom, which Ron was directing in New York. In the caption, he noted that it had recently been confirmed that he and Don Knotts were actually distant cousins, 6th cousins, according to the Hollywood Walk of Fame's documentation of Knotts' biography. Neither man had known it while the show was on the air. Don passed away in February 2006 at age 81, and Andy Griffith died in July 2012 at 86, both of them unaware of the family connection they shared with the little red-headed boy who had grown up beside them. When Don left the show in 1965 after 5 seasons, Ron believed it changed things fundamentally. He said the show was never the same for Andy after that. The absolute foundation of the whole thing, he felt, was the Andy-Barney relationship. The comedy they generated together, the warmth, the gentle foolishness. Without it, the show endured, but something essential had gone quiet. Frances Bavier, who played Aunt B. Taylor, was another significant presence in Ron's childhood years, though her personality off-screen was more complicated. She was private, sometimes difficult to know, but the ensemble around young Ron, Jim Nabors, George Lindsay, Howard McNear, and the rest, gave him a living laboratory in character work and comedic timing that no classroom could have provided. His younger brother Clint even made his own appearances on the show, playing a recurring character named Leon, a silent little boy who always seemed to appear offering someone a peanut butter sandwich or an ice cream cone. Leon never spoke. Clint Howard, 3 years younger than Ron, was in some ways an even more unusual case study in childhood in Hollywood, but that is a story that belongs to him. The world outside Mayberry. While the Andy Griffith Show was the anchor of his professional life throughout the 1960s, Ron was doing other things during the off-season, carefully, deliberately, one project at a time. In 1962, he appeared in The Music Man, the celebrated adaptation of the Broadway musical, playing Winthrop Peru alongside Robert Preston and Shirley Jones. He had a musical moment in the film, singing Gary, Indiana, a number that captured exactly the kind of sweet, earnest quality that made him so effective on screen. The following year, he appeared in The Courtship of Eddie's Father, a film starring Glenn Ford, where he played yet another gentle, likable son of a widower. It was a role type that fit him naturally, partly because it wasn't really a role type at all. It was just who he was. Village of the Giants came in 1965. 5 Minutes to Live was in the mix as well. These were smaller productions, B-movie fare in some cases, and his parents were careful not to overload him with them. The school year came first. Life came first. The Music Man and Courtship of Eddie's Father received enough attention that it was clear Ron had something beyond a single television role. He wasn't simply a child who photographed well. He could inhabit a character, find an emotional center, and make an audience believe him. But the Griffith Show remained the through line. 8 seasons. That's a long time for anyone to hold a job. For a child actor, it was extraordinary. He began as a 6-year-old boy who still had to pretend a plastic turtle was real and dead while trying to cry convincingly. And he left the show in 1968 at 14, already thinking seriously about cameras and the people who operated them. What being Opie did to him, and what it didn't. There is a familiar story that often gets attached to child actors, and it goes badly. The spotlight, the applause, the identity wrapped around a character, the slow disappearance of the work as the child grows out of it, and then the struggle to find something solid to stand on afterward. Ron Howard's story is conspicuously not that story. He has spoken many times and with consistent reflection about why he thinks he came through the experience intact. His parents were the core of it. They kept him in public school. They didn't let the money or the attention balloon his sense of self. They told him regularly that he didn't have to do any of this, that it wasn't being done for them, and it wasn't being done for financial security. If he wanted to stop, they would stop. He enjoyed it, and he was good at it, and he knew he was good at it. That combination, when surrounded by people who kept the rest of his life grounded, made for something sustainable. There was stress, though. The memoir he and Clint published in 2021, The Boys, a memoir of Hollywood and family, was the first time he'd spoken candidly and at length about some of the harder parts. Playing Opie had also invited bullying. Fame, even at the level of a beloved child actor, made him a target for some kids who wanted to knock something down. He dealt with it, but it was real. The book, which became a New York Times bestseller, was structured as a dual narrative, Ron and Clint alternating voices, weaving together the story of their parents and themselves. Rance and Gene Howard emerged from it not as background characters, but as the actual protagonists of the whole story. Rance set aside his own acting ambitions, which had been genuine and persistent, to serve his sons. He became their acting coach, their moral compass, their first audience. Gene was the protective force who watched hundreds of Little League games and made sure the boys understood that dinner at the Sizzler and family life mattered more than any contract. They described themselves, both of them, as sophisticated hicks, worldly enough to engage with the arts and the entertainment business, but homespun enough to live simply and stay grounded in what was real. That combination, Ron has said, was the essential gift. From Opie to Richie, growing up on television. When the Andy Griffith Show ended its run in 1968, Ron was 14. The logical next question for any young actor would be, what now? He continued to pick up work, appearances on various television programs throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s. But the transition from child actor to adult actor is one of the most treacherous passages in Hollywood, and almost everyone who attempts it loses something along the way. George Lucas changed things. In 1972, Lucas was developing a film called American Graffiti, a coming-of-age story set in 1962, following teenagers on one pivotal summer night. He saw an unsold pilot called New Family in Town, featuring Ron as a character named Richie Cunningham. Lucas used it to determine if Ron could play a teenager convincingly. American Graffiti came out in 1973 with a cast that would become legendary in hindsight. Ron Howard, Richard Dreyfuss, Harrison Ford, and others working for George Lucas before any of their subsequent careers had fully taken shape. The film cost $777,000 to make and earned over $115 million in worldwide box office, a staggering return on that investment. It was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture, and it launched a wave of 1950s nostalgia that reshaped American popular culture in the mid-1970s. One of the beneficiaries of that nostalgia wave was an unsold pilot that had been sitting in a vault, the very one Lucas had used to evaluate Ron. ABC went back and picked it up as a series. Happy Days premiered on January 15, 1974, with Ron Howard at the center of it, playing Richie Cunningham. He would stay with the show through 7 seasons until 1980, when he made a decision that not many people expected. He walked away from acting. He had been thinking about directing since he was 10 years old. The Super 8 shorts at home as a teenager had sharpened into something more serious. He enrolled at the University of Southern California's School of Cinematic Arts after high school, though he ultimately didn't graduate, but the instinct had never quieted. If anything, being one of the leads on one of the highest-rated shows on American television gave him leverage he could use. In 1977, while still on Happy Days, he directed his first feature film, Grand Theft Auto, a low-budget action comedy produced by Roger Corman. He essentially used his position as a television star to negotiate the directing opportunity. It wasn't unusual, he pointed out. Most first-time directors have to trade something to get the chance. An acting commitment, a writing credit, something. He had his name above the title of a hit show, and he used it. Grand Theft Auto worked well enough to open open more doors. Night Shift followed in 1982 with his Happy Days co-star Henry Winkler in the lead. Then came Splash in 1984 and a years-long working relationship with Tom Hanks that began there. Cocoon in 1985, Willow in 1988, produced by George Lucas, extending the friendship begun on American Graffiti, Apollo 13 in 1995, and the kind of critical and commercial success that made it impossible to dismiss Ron Howard as a television actor playing at film direction. A Beautiful Mind in 2001 won him the Academy Award for Best Director and the Academy Award for Best Picture. The child who had once pretended a plastic turtle was dead so he could cry convincingly on a soundstage at Desilu had become one of the most celebrated filmmakers in the world. The Girl in the English Class. For all the professional things that shaped Ron Howard, the Andy Griffith Show, Andy's mentorship, his father's quiet wisdom, the creative education of a Thursday read-through, there is a personal story that runs parallel to all of it, and it deserves its own telling. Ron was in English class at John Burroughs High School in Burbank when a girl named Cheryl Alley sat down in the seat in front of him. She was a petite redhead, and she had no idea who he was. Her father rented apartments to actors and didn't hold a particularly high opinion of the profession as a whole, so even the kids at school who knew Ron from television hadn't made much of an impression on Cheryl by association. According to the biography Ron Howard, From Mayberry to the Moon and Beyond by Beverly Gray, when Ron finally worked up the nerve to talk to her, they spent nearly an hour discussing her dog before he got around to asking her out. Their first date, Ron has said on Instagram, was on November 1st, 1970. What's striking about the story is how little his fame had to do with it. Most of their classmates knew exactly who he was. Cheryl didn't, and that may have been part of what made the whole thing work. She saw the person before she saw the television character. They married on June 7, 1975, at the Magnolia Park United Methodist Church in Burbank, California. The ceremony was simple, attended by close family and friends. They were both 21 years old. They would go on to have 4 children, and in a gesture of private whimsy, each child's middle name reflected the location where the child was conceived. Their oldest daughter, Bryce Dallas Howard, born March 2, 1981, is now a filmmaker and actress in her own right. Then came twins Jocelyn Carlisle and Paige Carlisle, sharing a middle name that refers to the Carlisle Hotel in New York City, and their son, Reed Cross Howard, whose middle name references the street in London where the family once lived. Bryce Dallas Howard has established herself as a director as well as an actress, continuing a family tradition that now spans at least 4 generations of people who have found their lives in front of or behind cameras. Ron has been asked many times what the secret to a 50-year marriage looks like from the inside. He has resisted the idea that there's a technique or a tactic. Communication matters, he said, and so does the willingness to have difficult conversations honestly. Beyond that, he said, there's luck. People either grow together or they don't, and you can't force that. He told a reporter in 2019 simply that he met her and there was never anybody else. Staying normal in an abnormal life. Something that comes through clearly in everything Ron Howard has ever said publicly and in what he and Clint wrote in The Boys is that the Howard family's greatest achievement wasn't the television show or the films or the Oscars. It was that 2 boys grew up in one of the most image-distorting environments on Earth and came out of it knowing who they were. The memoir, published in October 2021, became an immediate New York Times bestseller. Tom Hanks, who has worked with Ron across multiple decades and projects, wrote that the book was not only a chronicle of their early careers, but a primer on how to survive Hollywood as a kid and how to be the best parents in the world. Glenn Close described it as a love letter about life in show business that would settle on a reader's heart like soft rain. What the book makes clear is that Rance Howard's sacrifice was genuine and ongoing. He was an actor who had dreamed of stardom, had wanted, according to Clint, to be a singing cowboy like Roy Rogers or Gene Autry, and found himself instead playing the supporting role in his sons' careers year after year. He put that ambition on a shelf and became their teacher, their first critic, their moral center. His wife Jean had died before him. After Rance was gone, Clint said they were orphans. Writing the memoir together became a way of holding on, a way to honor the parents who had made everything else possible. For Ron, the book was also also a chance to look honestly at the parts of growing up famous that had been genuinely hard. The bullying that came with being recognizable. The strange experience of aging out of child roles while the show needed a child. The complicated feeling of being, at 14, both a successful working professional and a kid who just wanted to be a regular teenager sometimes. He said he doesn't regret any of it. He felt comfortable in that world, understood it, and knew he was excelling. But there's a difference between surviving something and thriving in it, and he's been clear that the difference for him came almost entirely down to Rance and Gene. Returning to Mayberry. The Andy Griffith Show ended in 1968, but Mayberry never quite did. In 1986, Ron Howard returned for Return to Mayberry, a TV movie that reunited most of the original cast: Andy Griffith, Don Knotts, Jim Nabors, George Lindsay, and others. In the film, Opie is grown and about to become a father for the first time, while Barney runs for sheriff only to hand the job back to Andy. Ron was 32 years old by then, directing commercially successful films, and yet stepping back into that world must have felt like slipping into something very old and very familiar. He has said, in interviews over the years, that what the Andy Griffith Show got right, what made it last beyond any reasonable expectation of a black and white situation comedy about a small southern town, was its understanding of community. The show had no traditional families in it technically. Andy was a widower raising a son alone. Barney had no wife. Aunt Bee was unmarried. And yet Mayberry functioned as a complete family, a community of people who held each other up. That, Ron felt, was why it still resonated with people. In 2008, he and Andy Griffith came together one more time for a brief online video, in which Ron appeared briefly as himself, then slipped back into Opie's mannerisms alongside Andy in Sheriff Taylor's uniform, and then morphed into Richie Cunningham alongside Henry Winkler's Fonzie. It was a few minutes of gentle comedy with enormous warmth underneath it, the kind of thing that only works when the affection between people is real. Andy Griffith died on July 3, 2012, at his coastal home in North Carolina at 86 years old. Ron spoke of him afterward with the kind of grief that belongs to someone you've known since you were too young to fully understand what you had. Andy's love of creating, Ron said, his joy in it, whether the work was drama or comedy or music, was inspiring to grow up around. He worked always with respect and passion, always in service of an audience he genuinely cared about. The life behind the life. There is a particular kind of person who grows up inside a public narrative and still manages to remain at the center of it. Ron Howard's hidden life was never particularly hidden in the melodramatic sense. There were no scandals, no dramatic falls, no reinvention stories driven by crisis. What was hidden was simply the private world that ran beneath the public one. The boy doing homework in a Burbank classroom while other kids watched him on television. The teenager shooting Super 8 films in the backyard while everyone assumed he was content being Richie Cunningham. The young man sitting across from a girl in English class, talking about a dog for an hour, working up the courage to ask her out. He turned 71 years old in March 2025. He and Cheryl have been married for 50 years. Their 4 children are grown. Their grandchildren are growing. He still makes films, still lends his voice as narrator to projects he believes in, still shows up to talk about the past with something that sounds genuinely like fondness rather than performance. He has 2 stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, one for his contributions in film, one for television. He has won 2 Academy Awards, 7 Emmy Awards, 2 Golden Globes, and 2 Grammys. He was awarded the National Medal of Arts in 2003 and inducted into the Television Hall of Fame in 2013, and he remains, for a generation of viewers who grew up watching a small-town sheriff and a little red-headed boy walk down a dirt road in the opening credits of a television show, he remains in some enduring and untouchable corner of memory. The name Opie came from a 1940s band leader that Andy Griffith had always admired. Nobody explained this to Ron when he was 6 and just trying to remember his lines. He learned it later, the way he learned so many things from that time. Slowly, looking back, piecing together a story from a childhood that had moved past him almost before he had a chance to understand it. He understood it eventually, and what he found, when he looked, was something most people who grew up in Hollywood never find at all, a life that belonged to him. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Ron Howard's story, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. It means more than you know and helps us keep telling the stories that deserve to be told.